I still do not understand people who claim to be Republicans running around having voted for Democrats in each of the last three elections, having advocated for Democrats to win the Senate, having advocated for Democrats to win the House, having advocated for pro-abortion policies, having advocated for every liberal social crusade, and then have to and look me in the eye and say, you're hurting conservatism by supporting Donald Trump. F all the way off. That's what I say.
So we're going to start there. This is part of a very long rant about Never Trumpers. But so before we get to the personal attacks on me, I want to dial in on his core argument for Donald Trump is that he will stand up for America and he will stand up for the West. Because I just think this is a fundamentally flawed argument that undergirds a lot of the rationalization for supporting Trump.
In today's video, Tim Miller destroys Scott Jennings on the Bulwark podcast. This clash gets intense fast because Tim Miller isn't just pushing back, he's dismantling Scott Jennings' entire pro-Trump argument with facts, history, and a reality check that the MAGA movement keeps trying to outrun. While Scott Jennings leans on the usual talking points about Donald Trump being some kind of defender of American values, Tim Miller brings receipts showing how Trump's actions actually weaken the very principles conservatives claim to protect: democracy, alliances, and the stability of the post-WWII Western order. Tim Miller makes it clear that rejecting Trump isn't abandoning conservatism, it's defending it, and he isn't letting Scott Jennings rewrite reality without getting called out. So let's dive in and watch how Tim Miller shuts down Scott Jennings on the Bulwark podcast.
That there's some idea that the left is out there and they're in league with the Sharia law Muslims and these other people that hate American values. And so you have no choice but to support Donald Trump, who likes to wave the American flag and claims that he believes in America and says he wants to make America great again. Here's the problem with that. Donald Trump is a direct threat on American values at home and abroad. And Donald Trump is a direct threat to the West. If you care about the Western world order, the post-World War II alliances that have allowed us to live peacefully in this world, that have created unimaginable economic success and freedom and liberty for people in Europe and here and throughout the world, then how can you then say you're for Donald Trump? Donald Trump is trying to unravel on all that. Donald Trump is trying to dismantle the Western world order. He said so. He went to the Middle East and gave a big speech about how all this talk in the past about supporting democracy abroad and all this stuff was naive, silly, dumb. All the stuff that all of the presidents from Kennedy to Reagan to Bush, all the stuff that all they promoted, that was just nonsense. And what you need to think about now is the new world order, the Trump world order, where realpolitik rules, where you have to be tough and you got to make good deals. So what's happening? We're already seeing what's happening to the West. You're concerned about the West, Scott Jennings. We're seeing what's happening to the West. A report out this week that says that Canada is starting to do more trade with China and less trade with the United States because they don't trust us anymore. You laugh about that on TV. You laugh and joke about Trump's, bullying of Canada, but it's having a real impact. Trump's bullying of Canada means that Canada is disentangling from us a little bit and entangling with China, a country that is, by definition, not part of the West. In Eastern Europe, you've got Russia trying to run roughshod over Ukraine. And just this week, you have the vice president and Trump's son-in-law and others and Steve Witkoff doing back-channel deals with the Russians to try to work with them to figure out, how to get Donald Trump to pressure Ukraine to surrender and let Russia have this new territory and weaken Ukraine and weaken NATO. Donald Trump has threatened NATO many times. The NATO countries themselves no longer really trust that we're a reliable ally, so they're trying to build up militaries of their own. Then you have the other thing that happened this week, which is that Donald Trump welcomed a Saudi Arabia Sharia law sand dictator to our country, feted him, had a grand ball at the White House, invited all of his best friends. They got up in their tuxedos and they feted him. They talked about how great he was. They made excuses for his murdering of journalists. It's like that. Like the world is reordering right now. The West is as weak as it's been.
When you listen to Tim Miller go off here, the reason it hits so hard is because he's pointing at something bigger than just Scott Jennings' talking points. He's pointing at a reality Republicans used to actually understand. And honestly, the idea that Donald Trump is some kind of savior of the West doesn't hold up when you look at how Western democracies themselves reacted to his presidency. Take Europe, for example. During Trump's term, trust in US global leadership plummeted across NATO countries, hitting historic lows in Germany, France, and the UK. That's not the behavior you see when someone is strengthening the West. That's what happens when allies start preparing for a world where the US might not show up anymore. And if you look at who did feel empowered during Trump's time, it wasn't the democracies, it was the authoritarians. Putin ramped up disinformation campaigns. Xi tightened China's global economic influence. Even far-right nationalist movements across Europe celebrated Trump because they saw him as weakening the institutions that usually keep them in check. Tim is also right to call out the economic ripple effects. Even after Trump left office, countries like Canada and Germany began shifting supply chains away from relying so heavily on the US because they no longer trusted the stability of American leadership. That's not just diplomatic gossip, that's real money, real trade, and long-term strategic planning. So when Tim pushes back, it's not personal or partisan, it's just acknowledging the obvious. Supporting Western values means supporting the alliances and institutions that actually built the modern West, not cheering on the guy who keeps trying to tear them down.
Because Donald Trump is annihilating our alliances and repositioning us where our new friends are El Salvador and Saudi Arabia. And who knows how things go in Eastern Europe? Maybe Russia. He's trying to do deals with Russia. That's what Donald Trump wants to do. If you believe in the West, if you believe in freedom of speech, free markets, free people, well, then you wouldn't be making excuses for a journalist murderer, right? You wouldn't be instituting a global tariff regime that makes it harder for people to do business with us. That's not supporting Western values. If all you mean by the West is that like you like white people and you want to make sure our country's whiter, I'm not saying that that's what Scott Jennings believes, but if there are some out there that make the argument that in order to protect the West, we need fewer brown and black people in the West. And if that's what you mean, then okay. All right, then yeah, Donald Trump is doing that. Like the one thing he's doing to protect the West is he is trying to make sure our country is whiter. That's not how I define the West. I think of it as a values proposition. But if you think about it solely as like a blood and soil nationalist way, then I get it. But if you're Scott Jennings and you're saying that you're arguing in defense of the kind of conservative tradition, the Bush-Reagan era conservative tradition, you know, generally that's not how we talked about Western values. So we didn't talk about it as related to whiteness. So when I look at Donald Trump at his scorecard, I see somebody that instigated an assault on the Capitol, that is weakening all of our democratic institutions, that is weakening our alliances with our Western allies, that is sidling up to Sharia law despots and putting in a tariff regime that makes it harder for people around the world to do business with us. I don't think that's preserving the West. I think it's doing his damnedest to accelerate the West's decline. So that's just one argument.
What Tim Miller is calling out here is something conservatives used to take seriously. The idea that Western leadership is built on credibility, not vibes. And honestly, if you look at what's happened the past several years, America's credibility under Trump absolutely cratered. During his presidency, trust in the US among traditional Western allies hit the lowest point ever recorded by Pew Research. Germany's trust dropped below 20%. Even the UK, our closest partner, saw confidence collapse. That doesn't happen when someone is strengthening the West. That happens when your allies start quietly drafting Plan B. And the whole new friends thing Tim brings up isn't an exaggeration. Under Trump, the countries that publicly praised the US leadership the most were Saudi Arabia, Hungary under Viktor Orban, and Brazil under Bolsonaro. All governments that were actively rolling back democratic norms at home. That's not the West. That's an axis of illiberalism. Plus, the tariff strategy had real economic consequences. Multiple US industries, from agriculture to manufacturing, saw billions in losses, and American exporters permanently lost ground to European and Canadian competitors. That's not protecting Western markets, that's gifting them to China, which swooped in to replace US suppliers in places like Canada, Japan, and South Korea. And when Tim talks about values, he's not talking theory. Freedom House actually downgraded the US during Trump's tenure due to attacks on democratic institutions, political rights, and the peaceful transfer of power. So if the argument is about defending the West, Tim's right. The scoreboard doesn't lie.
Now I want to get to the part where he talks about me and Nicole. Let's take a listen.
Tim Miller, this other Looney Tunes, he was supposedly a Republican operative. Now he is one of the most liberal people in our political affairs ecosystem. Did you ever believe any of it? And what is it about Donald Trump that made you change every single thing that you supposedly ever believed in? And I don't understand how one person could break so many supposedly smart and experienced people. But you look around, all these people who are making this argument that in order to save Republicans or save conservatism, you had to vote for Kamala Harris. I mean, that is the craziest bunch of crap I have ever heard in my life.
Okay, there you go. There's the rhetorical question. What is it about Donald Trump that made you change every single thing you ever supposedly believed in? I guess people would ask that question about you, Scott, because I didn't change every single thing I ever believed in. There are a lot of things I believed in that I didn't think were up for debate, right? I thought that this was a country that welcomed immigrants. This was a country where if you lost an election, you conceded. I thought that this was a country where you didn't, send direct messages to your attorney general telling them that you wanted them to target your political foes. Thought this was a country where we had a basic due process, where you didn't have masked guys jumping out of cars, grabbing people on the streets because they were brown. I thought we all agreed with that. And then once Donald Trump came in power and instituted the most illiberal regime in my lifetime, my parents' lifetime, well, then I realized, well, actually, we don't all agree with that, it turns out. And it turns out I need to stake out some ground on these other issues that were not up for debate before, where I am completely out of step with my former party. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so when Scott says I've become one of the most liberal people in the ecosystem, I know he means that as a pejorative, but I take it as a badge of pride. Because to me, liberal means defending the liberal values that undergird our society. And our president is an illiberal wannabe autocrat that basically took everything from Reagan's farewell address about how we're a shining city on a hill with doors that welcomes people so they can live a life of opportunity and meaning, and threw it in the garbage and said, no, now we're a country where we take people who come into this country who are fleeing communism, and we send them to a foreign gulag with no due process over the objections of a judge. That's what Donald Trump did. And so I think that the moment calls for liberalism. I mean, liberalism is the only thing standing between us and the abyss. And liberalism is the only thing that is standing between us and somebody deciding that they want to stay in power against the will of the people. And so I am guilty. I have been forced. Liberalism has been thrust upon me by Donald Trump.
What Tim Miller is getting at here is something a lot of longtime conservatives have privately admitted. The political landscape didn't change because people like Tim suddenly became liberals. It changed because the basic rules of democracy stopped being negotiable. And honestly, the data backs him up. Under Trump, US Democratic indicators dropped to their lowest point in decades. Freedom House downgraded the US 3 years in a row. The Economist Democracy Index labeled America a flawed democracy. That didn't happen because people shifted their ideology. It happened because institutions were being pushed past their limits. And when Tim talks about values conservatives used to consider foundational, he's not imagining things. Under Bush and Reagan, legal immigration was openly celebrated. Reagan even called America the world's last best hope and signed a sweeping immigration reform that legalized millions. Compare that with Trump's DOJ arguing in court that asylum seekers could be indefinitely detained without hearings, a stance multiple federal judges rejected as unconstitutional. Even the idea of conceding elections wasn't some optional tradition. For 220 years, presidential losers conceded without incident. Trump was the first to reject that norm, and it resulted in the first non-peaceful transfer of power since the Civil War era. That's not a policy disagreement. That's a full break with democratic continuity. So when Scott Jennings accuses people like Tim of changing everything, it's the opposite. They stayed put. The ground moved underneath them, and the record shows exactly who moved it. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing, and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center, are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out ground news in the description down below.